Very excited today to have one of my favorite speakers and one of my favorite board members from the World Affairs Council, Nawzad Othman, here, who will also be here on March 4th talking about ISIS, which I realize is sort of a funny pun, that ISIS is marching 4th. But we are going to be looking at the Kurds today, and nobody knows this subject as well as our man over here. Nawzad was born in Erbil into a Kurdish family with very deep connections into the history and evolution of the Kurdistan region. Nawzad immigrated to the US when he was 18, earned his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from South Dakota State University, and a Master of Urban and Regional Studies from Mankato State University, which is, a very, very glorious wheat-filled part of southern Minnesota. And he gained considerable experience as a transportation engineer, bridge and airport designer, and engineer in the Midwest and Oregon. And Nawzad was the co-founder of Otak, which became Oregon's largest and most respected architectural and engineering firms, with over 300 employees in Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Colorado, and Abu Dhabi, among other things. In 2012, Nawzad created the Othman Group to assist clients in the Pacific Northwest and the Middle East with business strategies, investment opportunities, and sustainable practices, and has also kind of spiraled off into being a speaker for organizations on all of these issues that he's going to talk about today. So give him a big hand.
Tim, thank you. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yep. Many familiar faces recognize. Kurds, who are they? They've been in the news the last few years, and they're in the news all the time. In fact, when you hear about the stories about the Kurds, the KDP, the Peshmerga in Iraq, who are very proud to say that they, during that whole occupation or the American involvement in Iraq, not a single American soldier was killed in Kurdistan. And in the initial fighting that they weren't successful against ISIS when they attacked Mount Sinjar and the Yazidis, and now they have gotten back, and they have probably just within Kurdistan about close to 400-kilometer front line with Daesh or ISIL, and they have been our boots on the ground to defeat the extremists. And you hear about the Kurds in Syria, the Rajavi, and many of you have seen the photos of, louder, all right. Many of you have seen the photos and what has happened, the epic saga of Kobani, the city of Kobani, just close to the Turkish border, and the bombardment that was inflicted upon them all the time. And they managed to defeat the Daesh in spite of the Turkish armament sitting on the border and not helping them, but the American Air Force was. And then from that, the Kurds, the YPG in Syria, have moved village after village and conquering the extremists. And at the same time, we have the Kurds, and you hear about them, the PKK, and has been identified as terrorists by Turkey and by the international community. They've been in war with Turkey for a long time. And Turkey, or part of NATO, the second largest military in NATO, are to help us, instead of helping us in their national community to fight Daesh. Actually, they are bombing the Kurds in Syria, the YPG, on the assumption that they are linked to the PKK. And part of it is that whole fear of what will happen with the Kurds. So you have this complex piece of the puzzle is going on between Iraqi Kurds and their consistent battle with the central government, and then the Syrian Kurds who want to be as autonomous as the Iraqi Kurds, and their battle, and they're winning the battles. And what's really interesting with and then you have the PKK in Turkey, What's interesting, beside what you hear about the news, it's all about the war, and the war against ISIS, and the war within their governments. There's a real difference between the three groups. For example, the Kurdish group who have attained their autonomy in 1991, in the Gulf War, when we established the no-fly zone, and they had their election and was the Kurdistan regional government. They are very much into the kind of a pro-Western free market economy they had set up. You go to the Syrian side of the Kurds, who are now fighting, and they want to accomplish the same thing, as an autonomous Kurdistan within Syria, as Iraq have done, but they're very egalitarian. And if you ever get a chance to go online and Google Kurdish women fighters of Syria, and it's amazing, the whole division about the fighters who are Kurdish women, which is contrary to what we hear about in the Middle East. And at the same time, they have established a system of governance that's totally bottom-up, very egalitarian and very open. And how does that happen? And then you go to Turkey with the PKK, who is identified as being a terrorist organization. They are the Socialist Workers' Party and kind of an offshoot from the old communist system. So you have all of these things. So who are these Kurds? Who are they? I don't want to go back into history, because there is sometimes you get caught up in whose history, what is fact, what's fiction. But maybe a bit of context about the Kurds. The Kurds today, by any estimate, is approximately 35 million people in that region. 35 million people, most people say that the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in contiguous areas without a country. And they're divided amongst the four countries of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. The largest, about 50% of that group is in Turkey. About 20% of Turkey's population are Kurdish. So somewhere about between 15 to 20 million. It's hard to describe exactly those numbers. In Iran, about 15% of Iran is Kurdish in the northeast. And they're about somewhere between 10 to 12 million. In Iraq, there's about 6 million. 6 million of Iraq are Kurds, about 17%. And in Syria, it's 2.5 million, about 10%. So when you add them all up, it's the largest group. And the Kurds historically, up until the First World War, historically have been really tribal, mountainous. There are some urban cities like Erbil in Iraq, their capital, Diyarbakir in Turkey, which is kind of the capital of the Kurdish region, Sanandaj, Kermanshah in Iran. They have been autonomous in the sense they never had their own country, and they have been under the influence of empires, was the Persian, Safavid, or the Ottoman Empire, or the Mongols, or the Alexander when we swept through the region. But to really understand the context, it begins with the First World War. At the First World War, Turkey allied with Germany, but Turkey was after 400 years of Ottoman rule, the Ottoman Empire was really shrinking, was losing its power, the zenith. The Allies, and all of you have heard the word Sykes-Picot, when the Allies defeated Turkey and Germany, France and England divided the countries, the key countries in the Middle East, amongst themselves, the two. And that was the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And that was modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, Transjordan. Even though this Treaty of Sevres that they had with the Allies had promised the Kurds, by then Kurdish nationalism has risen away from the tribal area into more urban, more educated. So the nationalism of the Kurds was embryonic as coming out of the First World War. They were promised a homeland, but it never happened because after the war, the modern Turkey came to rise too, becoming a secular country driven by Ataturk, and they were very nationalistic. So the Kurds at that time felt the notion of betrayal. So this has been kind of a history for them, the notion of betrayal and manipulation by both global powers and regional powers. So now, but the Kurds are, unlike the Turks or the Persians, actually similar to the Persian, both Indo-European, and the language is Indo-European. So Kurdish language, it is actually there are two components of the Kurdish language, the Kurmanji and the Sorani. The Kurmanji, which is mostly Turkey and the eastern part, western part, and the Sorani is Iraq and Iran. So now when people will talk about Kurds, among Kurds, they call them Northern Kurdistan, which is Turkey, Southern Kurdistan, which is Iraq, Western Kurdistan, Syria, and the Eastern Kurdistan, which is Iran. So since the First World War, throughout every one of those countries was upheaval and suppression. And in fact, if you look at the historically, 1923, right after Iraq became a government, was the first uprising by what was called Sheikh Mahmoud al-Barzanji. And this was in the city of Sulaimania in Kurdistan. It was suppressed by the Brits. In fact, the evidence is that the very first chemical attack in the Middle East, modern Middle East, was against the Kurds by the Royal Air Force. So you can see there's some of that history, and that it kind of started identifying, creating the psyche, how the Kurds felt. And since Sheikh Mahmoud and came Mullah Mustafa Barzani in the 40s and the 80s, and he is probably considered the George Washington of modern Kurdistan of Iraq. And his son, in fact, Masoud Barzani, today is the president of Kurdistan region. So there was all these, and then in Turkey, the same thing. Turkey as a very secular state, that was the whole vision, and very nationalistic state. Up until recent years, Kurds were not identified as Kurds, but identified as Mountain Turks. The same thing was happening in Syria against the Ba'ath. The Kurds, many of them, could not even have citizenship in Turkey and in Syria. Iran had the same upheavals. So there is that history of suppression, of ethnic cleansing. In fact, there's all kinds of evidence. There are hundreds of thousands in each one of these countries of Kurds have been relocated. Thousands of villages have been destroyed in Turkey, in Iraq. And if you remember what Saddam Hussein did to the Kurds, at the end of the at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, what was called the Anfal, over a couple 100,000 Kurds were massacred and relocated, 4,000 or 5,000 villages destroyed, and the chemical attack on the city of Halabja that completely killed over 5,000 people. So all of these are images. Now, but when you look at the Kurds, divided between those countries, Kurdistan, amongst all of them, is not monolithic. There is really, the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurds of Iraq don't necessarily think alike. But there's one common thread that you will find amongst all the Kurds of all those four countries. One is their incredible connection to their geography, which is the mountains. The mountains of Kurdistan in all those countries are mountainous region. They occupy the mountainous region of the Middle East, both in Mount Ararat is very holy for the Kurds, in Zagros Mountains, Helgur Mountains. These are the mountains that the Kurds, when you talk to them, and in fact, the famous thing, we have no friends but the mountains. I mean, that's a common lingo among the Kurds. And the other is the sense of Kurdishness. Even though they have been manipulated, even though they have been used and abused, even though they have fought amongst themselves. That exists. And the third piece that's really interesting, there is developed a social fabric in Kurdistan, which is really, that exists throughout the Middle East. And I think Tom has been in many of the Arab countries and Islamic countries. The sense of hospitality and giving is real. But the Kurds, because of their sense of identity, has taken that a step further. The connection between people is very profound. I love going there. I travel there 2-3 times a year. And aside from the roots and family and friends, it's just getting back and seeing this. It's actually quite energizing, and you see it happen. So now where are we with Kurds and Kurdistan? Every country is done differently. First, it's important to understand the Iraqi Kurds, because they're the ones that really achieved autonomy in 1991. And they had a parliament, and they had elections, they established the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. But the sense of nationhood was just beginning to find out. So what happened, they went to a civil war, fighting each other. And even though Kurdistan at the time, some of you may remember, when we had the no-fly zone, so Saddam Hussein doesn't attack them with his airplanes, we put severe restrictions and sanctions against Iraq. But Kurdistan being part of Iraq, they had a double sanction, both within Iraq and outside of Iraq. So that had really created unbelievable economic strain on this newly emerging autonomy. So they had a civil war between the two prevailing parties, the KDP and PUK. And many of the Kurdish friends on the outside were completely saying, look, you can't do this, you have to come together. But after 2-3 years of civil war, they did. They finally came together. And in 2003, the American, our invasion into Iraq, Iraq was a complete disaster, what happened. But the only group that emerged where the door was open to them, they didn't just open it, they blew it open. They really did. So they emerged as a commitment to economic development, commitment to kind of governance, even though they were trying to figure it out, even though there was issues of corruption, there were issues of transparency, but they did, in a very short time, created a vibrant economy. In fact, in 2014, what was called the Arab World Tourism Authority named Erbil as the tourism city of 2014. So you can see the transformation. But what's interesting, when you see what happened to the Kurds and what they could do, and especially when you see what's happened in the Arab Spring and in 2011, people can. The Kurds have done it, and others absolutely can do it. If given the right opportunity, they can prevail and can create vibrant systems. Not perfect, not democratic by our standards, but it works. So, but now with what's happening with the Kurds in Iraq is the central government of Iraq has been dominated by the Shia, and which is, again, dominated by Iran, has been extremely sectarian, and all of you know. Part of Daesh and extremism and the rise of ISIS has been out of the chaos that Iraq became, and out of the chaos that Syria became. But anyway, so the Kurds, for a year, did not even get their share of the budget. So many, for months and months, salaries were not paid to their military and to their civil servants. And not only that, in Iraq, Kurdistan, 1.8 million refugees have come in. Many of them are internal refugees, Christians, Yazidis, the people who fled Mosul, the city that was captured by ISIS. Arabs from Anbar province, Sunnis, escaping both from Daesh and the extremism, sectarian violence. Syrians. So not only they didn't have the money, not only they were fighting the extremism of Daesh, they had 1.8 million refugees to try to take care of them, and they were not getting the funds that they should get, either from central government or from the international community. But so you're dealing with, and they have a lot of potential, but the realities are very difficult for them. The Kurds want independence, especially the Iraqi Kurds. In fact, many of them now they have realized they've been empowered by their own. They have managed to create an atmosphere, the word may be never again. The difficulty is, for the Kurds of Iraq, which actually by 2005 or 2006, they had an unofficial vote within the Kurdish region, whether Kurdistan should be an independent country or separate from Iraq. The approval was 98% by the Kurds. Many of the young Kurds, younger than 25 years, have never known anything but Kurdistan. This was since 1991. And many of them don't speak Arabic. So that passion for independence is real. The difficulty is everybody is against them. Everybody. The Turks absolutely don't want that, because that will completely create the problem that they have with their own Kurds. The international community, the Syrian government, the Iraqi government, even us Americans say. So now they want it, but they're landlocked, and they know they will be very difficult for them to get it. So the answer for them is to make sure that the federal system or a confederate system is in place and is guaranteed. And this is, in fact, what the Syrian Kurds want, what the Turkish Kurds want. Now, what does that mean? That means the country stays intact, but the system is, if you take the American system, which is a federal system with state powers, we have state parliaments and so forth, but you take that to the next level, the model like in Canada, or the model of the UAE, and it works. Unfortunately, that system was adopted by us, the Americans, when we invaded Iraq, but it was never implemented properly by the central government. But if it can happen, that model would be a perfect model for those failing countries in the region, which has so many different minorities: Iraq, Syria, Yemen. So the application, and the international community supports it, I think it can work. It can work very effectively. So that is probably the answer for both countries. What's also ironic we talk about Turkey and their fight with the Kurds in Turkey. One of the closest partners of Iraqi Kurds is Turkey, government of Turkey. They are the #1 trading partner with the Iraqi Kurds. They have established a joint energy pact to allow for the Kurds to sell the natural gas and their petroleum to Turkey, Mediterranean port of Ceyhan, and to sell it outside. And then the Kurds of Iraq, instead of being helped by the Kurds of Turkey, in fact, many of the Kurds, the PKK of Turkey, have been very antagonistic towards the Kurds of Iraq. So you've got those internal divisions amongst the Kurds, and you've got the powers they're playing. So they all realize they're in a vulnerable time, but they at the same time realize they have a significant opportunity to have an impact. When you look at 35 million people, it would make them, if it was one country, the fourth or fifth largest in MENA, after Egypt, Turkey, and Iran, and maybe Algeria. But the reality is you will never have that country. So to them, independence in Iraq may come sooner than anyone else. But if a good, solid confederate system is in place, I think that would satisfy the nationalistic approach, both language and ethnicity, and running their own future. Today, where do the Kurds go? The Kurds have really emerged as a very, very significant player in fighting extremism of Daesh. Partly is their own sense of nationality, sense of nationalism, sense of wanting their own independence. Partly the Kurds are very secular and very moderate. And you'll see that throughout the Kurdistan of Iraq, Iran, or Turkey, and so forth. How do we get to a rapprochement with Turkey, rapprochement with its central government? And especially now what's happening, how the tragedy of Syria and what's going on with the Russians are at play, the Iranians are playing, the Shia militia from Hezbollah from Iraq are at play, the Kurds are in the middle of it. Turkey is number one issue is fear of an uprising by the Kurds. More than anything else, I think for us is to be driven by diplomacy. You cannot, I mean, the complexity of what's going on today in the Middle East is a bit scary. An accident, another plane downing by Turkey of Russia, between Russia and Turkey. And it's real, and people know that. Will the Iraqi government moderate its sectarianism? Will Iran be a partner? Iran has a lot of influence in the region. Will they be a partner in fixing some of that? That's really hard to tell. But for the Kurds, for now, our friends are our mountains. And for now, we are Kurds, and we will never go back to be suppressed by the likes of Saddam again. And that, you hear it all the time. Anyway, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I would like to...
There's one back there, and I'm actually, because I have the microphone, I'm going to ask a question. What is stopping the U.S. from supporting an independent Kurdistan?
Well, I think the fear in the U.S. Is that a partitioned Kurdistan creating a new country will add one other level of upheaval. And you understand that. I mean, right now you've got the war with ISIS, you've got the complete destruction of Syria, you've got the Arab Spring, and all of a sudden you partition Iraq and antagonize Turkey, a NATO ally. It will be very difficult. So I really think the U.S. is telling the Kurds, look, we're going to help you, we're going to support you, but take it easy, don't push too fast, don't push too hard. And the Kurds saying, yes, we will, but there's only, if the system doesn't work, we may not have any other option. So at least help us fix the system.
Thank you for coming today and speaking. My question, you've touched on slightly when you spoke about the natural gas and oil exports from Iraqi Kurdistan into Turkey. My question revolves around similar resources that are available in the Kurdish regions within Syria and Iran, and what specifically is happening with those resources, and can they come to the Kurdish people and be used by the Kurds?
A good question. In Syria, they know there's natural resources. It has not been really in the Kurdish region. So part of the Syrian autonomy, or within the Syrian Kurds' autonomy, within Syria itself, to use the model that the Iraqi Kurds have used. Now, they may have a different form of how they approach governance. They're more egalitarian than the Iraqi Kurds. But they want to use that resource to expand. And that's also a fear of others that being militarily strong, and they are, and having the resources of natural gas and oil, it gives them even so much more power to demand independence. So you have those two things going on. The Iranian Kurds, on the other hand, Kurdistan is the northeastern part of Iran with Kermanshah, with Sanandaj, and so forth. I don't think the resources are, I may be wrong, but the resources in Iran is the same as the oil resources like in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Syria. Iraqi Kurdistan's actually, they estimate the oil reserves is about 45 billion. 45 billion makes it about the 10 largest in the world. I mean, that's a significant piece. And they can supply natural gas and oil, both not only to Turkey, but ultimately even to Europe. So that's very important to them, because that gives them the economic power in economic independence. So the number one is security, governing security, personal security, economic independence, to create the kind of economy that the people get jobs and take care of their education and have a vibrant economy.
I thought it was very interesting that you pointed out, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that you pointed out that there's this relationship between Turkey and the Iraqi Kurds, but I was surprised at that. But are there any other Middle Eastern countries that are supportive of the Kurds, or are they just totally on their own and nobody else recognizes the positive things that they've been doing to fight ISIS and all?
Yeah, actually, good question. Because the Kurds, with the leadership of Barzani and the KRG, were really careful to reach out to the Arab communities. They have a tremendous relationship with the UAE, like Abu Dhabi, both in trade and commerce. And they have had delegations going back and forth. They have a very good relationship with King Abdullah of Jordan, and they have that. They have been in Saudi Arabia, and they have had support. And in fact, some Arab press has been anti-Kurd, but there are many who have been supportive of the Kurds. And what's interesting also within Turkey itself, in fact, the Kurdish party, for the first time in June of 2015, won 13% of the vote that made him eligible to be in the parliament. They had received a lot of support from the liberals, the minorities, women, that allowed the Kurdish party to excel. And so that was, so you have all these dynamics going on, and you just worry that nationalism and anger and accidents does not create something that all bets are off. So it's a very tricky situation.
Sir, I have two questions. One is Islamic is the religion of the Kurds, and the other question is when you're in Turkey, you're still hearing conversation about the genocide of the Kurds, and I'm kind of curious on what is. I know that Turkey and the Kurds fought, but one side says that's settling radicals down, the other side it's a genocide. So I was wondering about your comments on it.
Well, the Kurds are mostly Muslims, and they are mostly Sunni Muslims, even though they're Shia Muslims. And they're the Yazidis, who are actually practice Zoroastrian, which is 2,000-3,000 years old. They are in those of you who watched and what happened to them in Mount Sinjar and ISIS and so forth. And in fact, the Kurds and Turkey is an Islamic country and a Sunni country. But the genocide, I'm not sure if you're referring to the genocide that happened with Turkey and Armenians, but that wasn't part of the Kurdish thing, even though there was some evidence early on in the turn of the century that Kurds may have participated in some of that because of the religious connotation. But the Turkey and the PKK have been fighting for the last 20, 30 years. And in that fight, there have been thousands of people who have been killed. But I don't think the issue is a genocide thing.
I have a question. As climate change, as an element of what's happened in Syria with the drought that preceded it, is climate change an issue in the Kurdistan region?
Yes, climate change. In fact, I didn't bring that up. There are three things. External, that is not political. It's climate change is one of them. And if you take a look at the map of Asia and North Africa, all the way from India, there's a swath that goes through all the way to North African countries. It's been in drought for the last 5-6 years. And people feel it because it affects agricultural production throughout the region. It's Iraq, Iran, Syria. The Kurds, you see it to some effect, but the Kurds have been fortunate. The mountainous areas, when you have snowfall, you have rain and so forth. But still in the plateau, where historically has been rich agricultural land, it's been affected, being impacted. We have had a few years ago riots in Egypt about food prices. And so it's real, it's definite. The other is the price of petroleum, from $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel. And it's really impacting the ability of some of those countries to do what they want to do. But sometimes, I'm not sure that's a bad thing, because in some ways, oil has been a curse. And if you look at many countries that, with the riches of oil, look at Nigeria, Algeria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, they're not robust democracies. And sometimes, because of the oil, they've created an upside-down economy. And at the same time, created this ability for the ruling party to be absolutists and dictators, etc. So that's the other one. The third piece, it's some of you have heard in the news, it's called the Mosul Dam. The Mosul Dam is a dam 45 kilometers north of the city of Mosul, which is right now occupied by Daesh. It's over 1 million people. The dam was built by Saddam in 1984, but it's flawed. It sits on limestone and sits on the footing, the foundation, under a certain amount of water pressure, erodes. And it is the largest dam in Iraq, fourth largest in the Middle East. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimate it's the most dangerous dam in the world. If it breaks and if it breaches, and there is a big concern that it might, the water would be over 80 feet high. So that is one of those tragedies. How do you cope with that? So climate change is real, definitely. Yes?
I think over here. Thank you for a very clear, very strong presentation. We hear a lot from the Iraqi Kurds, we hear a lot from the Syrian Kurds, we hear a lot, even more from the Turkish Kurds. We hear very little from the Iranian Kurds. So can you expound a little bit on how they, where they are, how do they think and how do they look at the future?
Yeah, I think the Iranian Kurds, really not much has been happening because the center of gravity of the activities have really been Syria and Iraq for the most part. That's brought Turkey in, and Turkey and the PKK have been fighting. But the Iranian Kurds have been struggling for a long time. In fact, there have been all kinds of oppressions and hangings, and in Iraq, they have been suppressed by the mullahs in Tehran very, very severely. But the interesting common thread between Iran and the Kurds, they're both Indo-European. So the Persian language and the Kurdish language come from kind of the same, they're different, but come from the same roots. But the Kurds of Iran, like the city of Sanandaj, is right across the border from Iraq, where the city of Soleimani is, and there's an awful lot of similarity between the two. They have been quiet, but they're vying for their own sense of autonomy, their own sense of independence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nawzad. And for me, as an Iraqi, and back in 2003, I was one of the founders of the Iraqi Minorities Council. I do respect, of course, the right of self-determination for our Kurdish, for the Kurdish people. It's an international right, a human right. However, in relation to the question about what's preventing US from supporting the independence, do you think the issue of what's called the disputed lands on the boundary between Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq, there are areas that are disputed between the Kurds, the Kurdish government, and the Arabs, which is ironic because these lands, most of it belongs to the Christians of Iraq. And in Kirkuk, the Turkoman and Christians, of course, it's shared. So do you think this issue is affecting the stance of United States?
Yeah, good question. Actually, it definitely, because it's not just you look at the map, I mean, you know, being from Iraq, Iraq is a country of many, many minorities, Turkomans, Assyrians, Armenians, Chaldeans. Iraq, I'm sure you know, but for the rest you don't know, was a country rich with history of, there was huge Jewish community, there were huge Christian community in Iraq. And Kirkuk, which is the oil center, is a very large Kurdish population, but it also has a very large Turkoman population. And it has become an Arab population. So that is, how do you divide the line? If the Kurdistan becomes an independent country, and now it's really controlled by the Peshmerga, where would Kirkuk fall in there? Now, you can do it militarily and there become a big battle, or what is the peaceful negotiation trying to identify where that line is? The same thing, in fact, many Kurds live in Baghdad. And if the country was partitioned, the city of Baghdad is a mosaic of all kinds of people. And then you go into the city of Mosul, which has a small Kurdish group. So defining the boundary is a challenge, no question about it. And I think you're absolutely right. But what's happening, though, the Kurds are really pushing that. In fact, the statement they say, we definitely want to be in Iraq, but it has to be guaranteed that the Kurds and the Sunnah and the Shia, each one. So a good model for Iraq really become three regions. Kurdistan and Baghdad and South, which is primarily Shia, and the Anbar province, which is primarily Sunnah, as a federated system within Iraq.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Clearly,
who's just running this show?
Clearly, your talk is very timely given the recent bombings in Turkey. I'm wondering how you feel the United States can balance its alliance with a NATO ally in Turkey with the support it needs to continue with the Kurds in the various regions.
Very tricky. Today, for an example, Turkey tells the United States, you cannot help YPG, the Kurds in Syria, because they're connected to the PKK. To them, it's a terrorist group in Turkey. The United States says, wait a minute, as far as we're concerned, YPG is not a terrorist group, and they are our most effective fighters against ISIS, most effective. Turkey is not accepting that. In fact, they have moved artillery along the whole border, as you know, bombing the Kurds. So the United States is trying not to antagonize a NATO ally, but quietly, diplomatically is trying to put the pressure on. Just a few days ago, there was this bombing in Ankara, and 28 people got killed. And now it just came out this morning that the group has come out, and it's called TAK, which is an extreme group that once upon a time used to be with the PKK, and they split off. And they are the ones who claim responsibility. It wasn't the YPG in Syria. So you have that. Where that would lead, I'm not sure. Turkey is a very important player. It really is. And Turkey, if somehow, in fact, a few years ago, when Erdogan became president, the first few years of his rule, everybody has a lot of high hopes. A lot of people in the Islamic and Arabic world looking at Turkey as a country that has managed to integrate modernity and Islam well. He grew the economy, became robust. He controlled the impact of the military. And he started negotiations and peace talks with the Kurdish PKK. And then it turned. And then it turned. So now people refer to him as Putin in the Middle East. You know, who knows? But if that could change, if Turkey can use its influence to moderate, they will never accept an independent Kurdistan. Turkey will never do that. But resume the negotiations with the Kurds and be more moderate, you will find that the Kurds will actually be a great partner with Turkey.
This reminds me of a little bit of the Israeli-Palestinian situation between Turkey and the Kurds. What I'm asking, though, is given the Iranian influence on Iraq, is it really possible to have a federalistic system in Iraq, or if in the future, do you think that there will be independent states within Iraq rather than having one country?
Well, actually, Iraq today, the constitution of Iraq now, which was really, we pushed it, is a federal system. And it gave Kurdistan the autonomy, so they have that. But the system is not complete because it was based upon mutualities about sharing of resources, about helping. It is autonomous, but it's incomplete. So all that the Kurds are saying, let's make sure that what we already have in the Constitution is honored, it's working, and respected. So to them, if that happens, and I think it could be a meaningful formula for Iraq. And that formula could also be used, again, in Syria. Iranians, by the way, have no objection to a federal system in Iraq. They would support it, but they would have an objection to an independent Kurdistan where Iraq is actually partitioned. That is where the problem lies, and that's where the difficulty is. So I really think for the Kurds, the thoughtful Kurds, is let's make this work, and the future that may be a Kurdistan, but for now, let's make this work. But the Kurdish population, when I am there and I see them, there's a tremendous desire for an independent country.
So, Saudi Arabia, what's the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Kurds, and is there reason for it to evolve or change? I mean,
Saudi Arabia has, I think some have come out publicly, they don't want Iraq partitioned. But Saudi Arabia also has come out and said because of the connections that the Kurds have made with Saudi Arabia, that they respect the Kurdish rights, but not as a partitioned Iraq. So you see that happening. Unfortunately, today in the Middle East, you have so many layers of conflicts going on. You've got proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, playing out in Yemen, playing out in Syria and Iraq, and so forth. And that is actually, if that is not contained, and if that is not come to some kind of a rapprochement, it could be a disaster for the region.
let's give Nawzad Othman a big hand.
Thank you.
And remember, he will be back here March 4th talking about ISIS, and next week we have Vandy Kanyako who will be talking about the United Nations. So we'll see you then.